Good news, guys! I won! I won the passes to the movie and the premiere. Woohoo! Bad news. There's no transportation provided, and so I didn't go because I live in Massachusetts, and I didn't know that because otherwise I wouldn't have entered the contest if I'd known I couldn't win. Anyway, I'm really surprised that you guys actually liked the stupid story that I put up. I don't think it's very good. It's kind of cheesy, and it just, I don't know, I don't think it's very good. But apparently you guys like boring stories, so I have a boring story here that I'm going to read for you guys. I'm not even going to make skits anymore, I'm just going to read boring stories. So here we go, here's a boring story that I wrote that won't thrill you at all. Our story takes place in the Penwill household one brisk Sunday afternoon in autumn, in a cosy little corner of Oxfordshire. Mother Penwill was in the kitchen whipping up a fresh batch of sugar biscuits, humming a tune as she mixed and stirred. Little Arthur Penwill was sitting at the writing desk by the window, nearing the completion of yet another ship in a bottle, the building of such trinkets being a favourite hobby of his. In his thoughtful little mind he liked to imagine that his ship was taller than his very own house, and that he was not simply the ship's builder, but its captain and brave leader of its faithful crew. Meanwhile, young Natalie Penwill was sitting upon the worn green knit rug, combing the hair of her favourite doll, with the greatest of care, and inhaling deeply as the sweet scent of her mother's baking wafted into the room. Father Penwill was resting blissfully in his favourite armchair, occasionally interrupting his own reading of the daily news by giving his two children loving looks of admiration. Just as Mother Penwill began to make a second batch of biscuits, the grandfather clock by the mantel chimed once, signalling that it had just become 1 o'clock. Upon hearing the clock chime, young Natalie Penwill began to take notice of the grandfather clock. It had a magnificently smooth finish of hearty wood, finely crafted in a manner that could only be done by a most certainly skilled craftsman with the greatest of attentions to detail. Each and every visible component of the clock complemented the components around it, and altogether it was an absolute work of art. The clock had stood exactly where it was as far back as Natalie had lived in the house. She began to wonder how long ago the clock had been placed in that very spot, and where it had migrated from prior to that. She suddenly had a peculiar theory that perhaps it had never stood elsewhere, and it had, in fact, been constructed right on the very spot it stood, much like Arthur's ship in a bottle. Having much more faith in her father's wisdom than her own, young Natalie Penwill asked her father, "Daddy, where does our grandfather clock come from?" "Well, you see," explained Father Penwill, "the clock comes from this very house, because it was constructed right here." Little Natalie's eyes widened with curiosity and wonderment. "Surely you're joking," exclaimed Natalie. "Not at all," responded Father Penwill. "You see, this house was once a clock factory." "Are you quite serious, Daddy?" inquired young Natalie Penwill. "Certainly not," exclaimed Father Penwill, at first feeling proud that he had duped his own daughter, and then suddenly feeling ashamed that the British educational system had failed her so. "Ah, well, at least the boy's not dull," he thought to himself, not realizing he was speaking his thoughts out loud as well. "That's not very nice, Daddy," said young Natalie Penwill. But Father Penwill had informed young Natalie many times before that women are not entitled to have opinions of their own, and began to scold her. As he opened his mouth, Father Penwill remembered his vow he'd made just 2 nights ago to speak no more than 8 obscenities to his daughter over the course of one day, and how he'd wasted no time delivering the very best 8 insults that came to him during breakfast earlier. Having realized this, Father Penwill then realized he'd made no such oath preventing him from providing his daughter physical anguish as opposed to mental anguish, and so he swiftly grabbed a nearby poker from the stand by the fireplace. The fire had not been lit since the night before, but even though the poker was cold, it still provided the wallop that suited Father Penwill for beating his own daughter to a bloody pulp. Finally, young Natalie Penwill was rendered unconscious, and after a moment or two, Father Penwill realized that there was no satisfaction in his blows if they didn't result in the screams of pain that he desired. Upon coming to this realization, Father Penwill then took notice of his son, who was standing in the corner with a look of absolute horror on his face, a puddle of his own urine around his shoes, and his bottled ship held tightly to his breast. Father Penwill wasted no time pulling Arthur's precious ship from his feeble grasp so that he could throw it against the wall with all his might. The glass shattered along with what was left of Arthur's spirit, and suddenly Father Penwill was looking down on a broken, weeping husk of what his son was just moments ago. Still, despite the pathetic state he'd brought his son to, Father Penwill continued to feel it necessary to go into his son's room and begin breaking each and every object little Arthur held dear. Before destroying each object, he said the name of it loudly so that Arthur would know what was being destroyed from the living room, where he lay in a bowl sobbing so hard that he could hardly hear all his favorite material possessions make loud contact with the floor. Unable to cope with her own anguish any more, Mother Penwill informed her husband between her own sobs that she intended to call the police. "I am the police, mother f***!" yelled Father Penwill as he gave his wife a good sock in the jaw, knocking her backward and causing her to trip over her own daughter's bloody, unconscious body. Just as Father Penwill began to violently rip off Mother Penwill's clothes, the author of this story suddenly remembered that young children who have irresponsible parents were most likely hearing this story, and so, under the command of the author, a magic pixie flew into the room and undid all the terrible things that made this story enjoyable for the listener. And so it was that the scene went back to being completely and utterly mundane, and they all lived happily ever after without any detail worth mentioning at all. The end.